I think I'm going to, because we hadn't heard each other's presentation before, so I think I might want to expand a little bit on the museum, the problem with museum collections. So I think Nari spoke a little bit about how museums are products of colonialism. But I think that I need to expand a little bit upon it, largely because of the previous session, which talked about the soft power of Britain, without referring to colonialism even once. So there is now an emerging consensus that the so-called world museums, and this includes the ones in Europe and some in America, are in fact deeply problematic products of colonial enterprise and imperialism. The period in which the museum structure became popular in Europe is also the period in which European powers were literally plundering their way around the earth. And most of the collections in these museums today come from such depredations. But my concentration today is not just about the objects that live in these museums, but also the way in which narratives about these conquered, colonized nations have been formed and continue to be formed even today. This is a more subtle, insidious, and in my view, a much more long-lasting loot. This is the creation and extension of cultural and narrative terrorism, which demanded, and still demands, that native and local forms, practices, histories, and objects find validity and expression only when presented in European languages, through the European institutional framework, which is the museum, and academy, which is the publishing press, and through the lens of the European, often white expert. And that, unfortunately, is how not only these cultures are framed by the white world, but it's also, the most tragic part is that this is the way colonized nations frame each other. So we don't know China through what we know about China, or should know through primary research. We know it through the European lens of colonialism. And that is also the way China knows us. This is a huge problem. So the colonial narrative essentially frames everything we know about the non-white world, and that's the problem, and museums are part of it. Recently, there was a very interesting debate, I think Nari was going to refer to it, about the repatriation of certain bronzes from Benin by the French president. And this should have been a universally welcome development. Finally, a colonizing power had recognized that they had no right to loot stuff from the country that they had colonized. However, very surprisingly, there were huge outpourings of opinions saying why this was a bad thing and why museums should not repatriate objects. So a very moving article appeared in Al Jazeera, of all places, and it said, I think the columnist is not from the museum world, which is why it particularly resonated with me. And she says, quote, "I wonder who appointed these museums and the white cultures they exist in, guardians of the culture, and more importantly, who are they guarding it from? The tendency for whiteness to universalize itself and elevate its own cultural specificity as a stand-in for humanity's collective heritage has devastating consequences for those who find themselves outside it." The peculiar taxonomies of display that museums engage in. For example, a curator does one gallery at a time, but what ends up happening is that vast narratives about entire civilizations get told to audiences who, as Nari pointed out, completely trust that narrative because the museum is a sacred space of propaganda. So essentially what ends up happening is that if lies are being propagated, we believe them to be perfectly true. Museums are beginning to correct this narrative, but not quickly enough. Frankly, changing a museum like the V&A overnight, or the British Museum overnight, or the Met overnight, is not possible. It's logistically impossible, and it's nightmarishly expensive. So clearly, people try to put patches on the narrative rather than correcting it entirely, which is how it really should be, but isn't going to be, at least in the foreseeable future. So how do we look at the underpinnings of how museums work? We can't do it with the older institutions because they're just too complex and there are just too many conflicting stories in there. but we can look at it when new museums get built. So I'm going to give an example of two museums that I think represent two emerging ideas about what museums can be. So the Middle East, as Nari pointed out, is a huge focus of museum building activity, and so is China. So in the Middle East, there are a couple of very ambitious museums. One of them is the Louvre, Abu Dhabi, and then the Museum of Islamic Art in Doha. The one private museum I find particularly fascinating is the Miho Museum near Kyoto in Japan. Can I have my slide, please? Well, anyway, it was establishing. Next one, please. It's an establishing shot of the Miho Museum in Kyoto. So this museum was set up by the founder of a religious organization or order, and in 1997. So she started this museum's process after meeting the architect, I.M. Pei, who built this absolutely beautiful building in the middle of a beautiful forest. And the founder, Miho Koyoma's own collection was housed in this museum initially, and it expanded gradually over the years. But what I like about it is its curatorial intent. So the order to which Miho Koyama belonged believes that the contemplation of art is a spiritual act. So when you look at something and you find it beautiful, there is something profound and uplifting in that experience. So this museum structure exposes deliberately and consciously the relationship between the founder, the architect, the curators, and the dealer network through which the artworks were procured. So as you can see, these are two objects which are from the ancient Orient. I use the word Orient because the museum uses it. They seem to have no critical problems with it. But the labels are very brief. The objects are presented with some information, but in a historical way and without the normal tedious political narratives that accompany museum labels. So what this allows us to do, and this is the primary experience of the visitor, is that you see ancient objects as you would see modern works of art. So you see them as beautiful things without being commentary as an ethnographic representation of an alien culture, which unfortunately is the way in which many museums show works of art that are not European. The second museum I want to talk about, let's see, there's another slide from the Miho. Yes, so the second museum I want to talk about is the Louvre, Abu Dhabi. It's one of the most significant museum openings in our world. It's only about a year old, but this is what it looks like. It's Jean Nouvel's design. It's brilliant, beautiful. There's a lot of money that is used to run it. And the acquisition fund is very rich. As the name suggests, it was set up by the Louvre in Paris, one of the world's foremost museums, both in terms of reputation and visitor numbers. So this is, the reason I find this particular museum fascinating is because it is one of the only so-called world museums formed in a site which is not a former imperial or colonial power. So what it has the right to be is to be, how can one country represent the world, or how it sees the world? That is what it's capable of doing. Did it succeed? Let's have a look. Oh, apparently I can move my own slides. Oh, there. That's the building. It's rather beautiful. So this is the opening display of the Louvre, Abu Dhabi. In my opinion, it's one of the most successful opening permanent displays in a museum. The floor design, this is permanent, is etched in different languages with all the places of origin from where the collections come. And one of the slides shows the masks from different parts of the world. So basically, the idea of the museum is to show an interplay of civilizations. So here they show 3 different masks from 3 different continents. So it's Peru, China, and the Middle East. This is very successful. It shows that people essentially are the same, which is the message of the museum. But does it succeed in telling those messages in successive galleries? And the answer is no. And the reason for that is because it is a Louvre a derived project. The Eurocentrism is poisonous. It leaches through into every display, into every curatorial decision, into every acquisition. So in the end, you get a large bunch of Europe and very little of anywhere else. So you have a world history told in which China interacts with, through the Middle East, interacts with Europe. So places like India are completely eluded. Of course, as an Indian, I look out for Indian arts and Indian objects, and I found us to be dramatically underrepresented. There are multiple reasons for that, and I'll go into that. One of the problems with the underrepresentation of Indian art is logistical. You can't really buy a lot of Indian art in the open market today, and that brings me to the last part of my talk, which is about why. What are the problem with Indian laws that prevent India's art market from developing in the same way like the rest of the world? So unfortunately, India stands very low in the wider economy of cultural exchange within the museum network. We don't have enough well-run museums. This is sad because we started the race at the same time and the same impetus as the world museums I mentioned. While museums were being built in London and elsewhere, they were also being built in India, both by the British and by the Indian princely order, which made grand buildings and endowed them with collections, staff, and funds. But after independence, socialism made museums into overt tools of state propaganda, while at the same time stripping them of funds, staff, and autonomy, so that these institutions, rather than becoming places for scholarship, expertise, and conservation, became sites of acute mediocrity and malpractice. After independence, Indian attitude to art also changed. It became a rather Soviet one. Art was seen as frivolous and expendable and a luxury for the rich. So our own dharmic connection with rasa and kala was broken. And so while in British India, wealthy Indians made important collections of art on the model of the European civility and taste, the Tata gift to I'm going to try to say the name because it's complicated, the Chhatrapati Shivaji Vastu Mahasangralaya or something, CSMVS. It used to be the Prince of Wales Museum, which is a colonial name, but easier to pronounce.
May I request you to conclude?
Okay. So, but the end result is, due to our bad laws, Indians today, wealthy Indians, spend the lowest proportion of their disposable wealth on art as compared to any other part of the world. I know, not a big problem for the large picture of things, but a huge problem in the way soft power is conveyed. So the big law that is responsible for this, and this is about how we can tick off solutions, is a 1972 act called the Antiquities and Art Treasures Act. It essentially means that the Indian art market is completely segregated from the world market. If you buy things abroad, you can't bring them in here. If you have things here, you can't sell them on the open art market. All this does is it encourages thieves and smugglers. So Indian art, which is authenticated, has provenance, is very hard to get hold of, so art collectors can't buy it and museums can't buy it. The second major bottleneck is that museums are not autonomous. Our museums are run largely by bureaucrats, which means that there is very little idea of international best practice in how museums work. The third is what Nehru says about the network of exchange. Museums have a very well, I mean, there are huge problems with their museums run. I pointed some of them out. But what they have is certain best practice. They are able to get large amounts of art from one part of the world to be shown in another part, and they're very good at that. For example, you have modernist masterpieces in Russia showing in London, you have art from France showing in the Middle East, and you have China sending the first emperor terracotta warriors to Britain. These are all very successful examples of public diplomacy and soft power. India can't engage in this because it doesn't accept something called sovereign indemnity. This is a very easily fixable problem. Sovereign indemnity simply means that the government of the country accepts insurance for museums that are national or national standing. But India, if I want to bring some art into India, I have to buy commercial insurance for it. Sovereign indemnity works in both directions. For example, if India accepts sovereign indemnity, then any work of art coming into India can also be ensured.
May I please request you to conclude?
Oh, that's it. So basically, we have logistical bottlenecks. We need to fix them. Only then will our museums be able to operate on an international level and basically help with the soft power initiative. Thank you.